I bid you all welcome to this first seminar of the Nordic Labour History Network, the new seminar session series we have. My name is Jonas Söderqvist. I work at the Swedish Labour Movement's Archives and Library, and I will function as a technical host for this session. And with this, I leave the floor to Jesper Jørgensen, who will introduce our speaker today.
Okay, thank you, Jonas, and welcome everybody to the Nordic Labour History Network's first webinar of this season. As Jonas told you, my name is Jesper Jørgensen, archivist at the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen. The topic of today is the Danish Social Democratic Party and NATO. And what a hot topic that is right now with the social democratic headed governments in Finland and Sweden seeking NATO membership because of Russia's war in Ukraine. The last time we saw a situation like this was after the Second World War, when Denmark and Norway joined NATO. But now again, the Nordic social democratic tectonic plates are moving. Also within NATO countries like Denmark, the skepticism of earlier times is swept away. Never has Danish social democrats been so enthusiastic about NATO and about spending money on the military. What's the story? To tell us, we have invited Iben Bjørnson, PhD in social democratic anti-communism in the Nordic countries during the Cold War, and until recently curator at Stevnsfort Cold War Museum, but now researcher at the Royal Danish Defence College. Iben will talk for 30 minutes, and then there will be time for comments and questions. The floor is yours, Iben.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I feel I need no further introduction, perhaps except to say that sort of my two, as you hinted at, my two main research areas have been the Cold War and social democracy, and obviously in Denmark those two are very well connected. So I start this presentation by sort of an event that took place in February, before Russia went into Ukraine, I should say, that the Danish Social Democratic Prime Minister presented a deal that or presented the prospect of a deal with the United States about stationing United States troops in Denmark. And that is a marked break from Danish NATO policy. But I actually want to go back even further. You can see the title is Pacifist, from Pacifist to Super Ally. And I think the curious thing is not only obviously that there's been a break in NATO policy, but also the involvement of the Social Democratic Party from pacifist or anti-militarist, I should say, party, socialist party, to this really sort of very enthusiastic NATO member. That sort of proportionally within NATO, Denmark has contributed more than most countries, especially to armed conflicts and overseas operations. But the pacifist or anti-militarist origins of the Social Democratic Party is obviously its socialist origins. Back then, in before the First World War, I should say, war was something that capitalists waged. It was something that imperialists waged. It was obviously not for the working people, and it certainly were not for social democratic parties. So that is sort of the foundation, the socialist foundation, one can say, and the Social Democratic Party was established as part of the Socialist International. Now, I've made a list here, just an overview of the periods in which Denmark has been in government in Denmark, and as you can see, it's quite a lot. And we just got the news that we are going to vote again on the 1st of November. So it'll be interesting to see if we still have a social democratic government or something else after that. But this overview of sort of these very long stretches of government also sort of speaks into how the Social Democrats sort of left their status as anti-militarist. The first step, I argue, was taken with World War I, and that was not just Denmark, that was labor parties all over Europe that sort of abandoned. Well, the Second International broke down. It's said sometimes, as I write, that it died in 1914 and was buried in 1917, and that's obviously because the socialist parties or labor parties, social democratic parties of Europe, especially Germany and France, turned inward and actually voted for war credits and supported the war effort. And all of a sudden, this international movement that had talked about sort of laborers in every country unite, all of a sudden these laborers or these workers were sent out to kill each other instead of uniting, and the social democratic labor parties took responsibility for that and was part of that. Also in Denmark, it wasn't the war that was the occasion, but during the war there was a kerfuffle over the sale of the Danish West Indies, a colony in the Caribbean, and sort of to smooth that over, the Social Democratic chairman was made part of a crisis government, and that also sort of meant making the Social Democratic Party in some way responsible for national policy. And this is the first time that we have a social democrat in government. So even if he was sort of an extra, in Danish it's a minister uden portefølje. I'm not even sure what it is in English, but this is the first time that a social democrat was in government, and that is actually, there's a point missing here. Because this is the development of the 30s, and I should say this is the development of the sort of security policy dimension of the 30s, which was an increased pressure from Germany, obviously, or uneasiness about German armament after Hitler took power. There was questions about whether neutrality could hold, and especially among the younger generations of the Social Democratic Party, there was this increasing uneasiness with this anti-militarism. What is not on this slide, and I think maybe is the most important movement of the party in this period, is this movement from party to state, and that is the movement that was started with Stauning becoming a minister in this crisis government, and the Social Democrats formed their own government for the first time in 1924, lasted only 2 years, and then they came to power again in 1927, and then they sat until 1942 in the war, when that's another story that I will get to. But so they were in power all throughout the 30s, and they sort of established themselves as the national party and the party for the Danish people. They even had a big campaign about how they were all for the Danish people, and they were this sort of collecting. In Sweden, you have the same notion. It's called the Folkhem, and it's this notion about the Social Democrats sort of uniting different interests and sort of becoming the National People's Party, and you obviously have movements like this in Sweden and Norway as well, where the social democratic parties are successful in establishing themselves with such a broad reach that they actually also gain a majority of the votes. And so in this move, I argue, and others with me, and I have written about this, is that they make a move from a class party to a state party. They stop identifying with the working class and they start identifying with the state, and sort of identifying their own interests, or the party interests, with state interest. And I actually have built this work on Swedish sociologists that have made the same argument in Sweden. And with this identification with the state is also this notion of being taking responsibility for national policy. You can't just sort of sit in your corner and represent your class interests anymore. You have to assume the wider responsibility for all of the nation. And I argue that this also plays into this increasing willingness to reassess this pacifist, this anti-militarist notion, and also the willingness perhaps or to rearm the country, because the anti-militarism was from a party that was sort of opposed to the state. Now we have a party that identified itself with the state, and obviously then you all of a sudden also have the responsibility for the foreign policy in an external environment that is becoming increasingly threatening. You just had a huge war, and now you have Germany, which is also a neighbor to Denmark, which is also scary. So this is the change I argue is happening in the 30s. Let me just then World War II happens, and Denmark is occupied by Germany, and neutrality failed, and that's sort of there's not much else to say about that, other than obviously Denmark learned that just because you say you're neutral, it's not necessarily going to be respected, especially if you have a huge and rather aggressive neighbor that is out to conquer the world, or at least Europe. Then you have to somehow protect that neutrality, and Denmark wasn't able to do that. So that is an important lesson. And I should say that the Social Democrats tried to steer Denmark through the war by building a broad coalition of collective government with all the parties represented, except the communists. That's another story. But this government held until 1943, the summer of 1943, when the government stepped back over increasing demands from Nazi Germany, and from then on it was basically government officials running the country. So here the line breaks of sort of uninterrupted social democratic rulership, but they still were very much in the background. So we come out of the war with this overriding slogan, which is "Aldrig mere 9. april," never again April 9th, which obviously is to say we should never again just be run over. As opposed to Norway, Denmark didn't really fight the German occupation. We just sort of rolled over and surrendered, and that was, for many people, especially in the light of Germany ending up losing the war, very, very shameful, and that was sort of a notion that that should not happen again. So in the first few post-war years, Denmark actually aimed for keeping neutrality and keeping the country neutral, and tried to do this through the United Nations, which was also established in 1945, and tried to pursue sort of a non-bloc policy, because obviously already in the immediate post-war years, these contours of two blocs were beginning to form, and this is what came to be the Cold War. Obviously a Sovietization of Eastern Europe and a Westernization or Americanization of Western Europe, if you will. So when the UN and the US and the USSR, they sort of increasingly came at odds, and that also caused the security system in the United Nations to break down, because they kept vetoing each other in the Security Council. So this possibility of pursuing neutrality and world order through UN failed. The next option for Denmark was then to pursue a Scandinavian Defence Union with Sweden and Norway, and as most of you probably know, that collapsed, and the reason for that collapse was that Norway wanted to be sort of tied to the West, whereas Sweden wanted to remain neutral. And all evidence points to Denmark being on the side of Sweden, still wanting to, or preferring to remain neutral, preferring for such a union to remain mutual, but also being willing to tie it to the West if that would make it happen. But as it didn't, Norway joined NATO, and Denmark sort of followed. Sometimes it says in Danish research that dragging its feet into NATO, Denmark was, and the prominent Danish social democrat described it as the lesser of two evils, and obviously the other evil would be sort of standing defenseless in case the Soviet Union would attack, and that was obviously the fear at this point, was an attack from a Soviet Union, because they were expanding in Eastern Europe, and they made this forced friendship pact with Finland, and there was very much a worry, I think, about where they would stop the Soviet Union. So standing defenseless was a bigger evil than joining NATO. So it was a very, should we say, foot-dragging party, and it was also a party that was really split in its grassroots. I think in the social democratic grassroots, it was almost 50-50 for and against NATO, and also in the Danish population at large, there were like huge anti-NATO sentiments. So that also sort of made it a tightrope for them to walk. Now, I could also have said policy vis-a-vis NATO, because you have these notions of deterrence versus reassurance, and they're paired with these other notions that Rolf Tamnes, the Norwegian researcher, came up with, of screening and integration. So if you pursue deterrence towards the Soviet Union, you are integrating yourself in NATO. If you want to reassure the Soviet Union that you don't have any ill will or any ill intentions, you screen towards NATO integration, and that is sort of the conceptual framework for Danish and Norwegian NATO policy even. And then I've added another, which is the relation between stress sensitivity and influence capability, and that's just basically a fancy way of saying that if stressors from outside and your external environment are big, it reduces your influence and your capability of influencing. So if tension and stress in the international environment recedes, you have more of a wiggle room to pursue your own policy. Now, this is sort of this is the screening policies towards NATO that Denmark pursued in the 50s. Was no American bases and troops stationed in Denmark, no nuclear weapons under the present circumstances and that was usually taken to mean peacetime. This did not apply to Greenland, obviously, because there were both an American base and nuclear weapons there. But these reservations was part of the screening towards NATO and also the reassurance towards the Soviet Union, the sort of a Danish signaling that we're not out to attack you if you don't attack us, and in general that is a policy that Norway also pursued and which sort of earned the Nordic countries or Norden sort of a mark of being a low tension area, also because of Swedish neutrality and the Finnish friendship with the Soviet Union. So Denmark also sort of screened from NATO integration to keep this low tension area, and that was obviously also to, if a war would come, then hopefully it would hit less hard in a country that didn't have nuclear weapons, for example. This has caused Tamnes, Willum, which is like two of the most prominent Danish NATO researchers, to talk of both Norway and Denmark as allied with reservations. So the 60s and 70s is a good example of the outside stress reducing and then increasing the influence capability. And Denmark took a very active role in NATO and sort of promoted. NATO is obviously a military alliance, but Denmark was one of the countries that actively promoted that NATO should also have a political dimension and a dimension to pursue detente and decrease tension. And as after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the superpowers began sort of talking together and establishing a regime of arms control, and Denmark really sort of really used this opportunity that was sort of the lesser tension in the world to be very active for diplomacy and detente. Detente ended in 1979, and then came the period which is also known as the Second Cold War, the New Cold War. This was, to say the least, an interesting period for Danish social democracy, because until now, the Danish security policy and NATO policy had been marked fairly by consensus. I'm sure the right-wing parties were more sort of defense-friendly and wanted to spend more money on defense, but overall, so the Social Democratic Party led the way and were able to secure a broad consensus behind their security policy. So it was formulated by the Social Democrats, but backed up by all. This changed in the 80s when the Social Democrats, for the first time really since the 20s, became an opposition party for a longer period of time. While that happened, there was also a generational shift within the party. There were young voices that were very much against this renewal of the Cold War and this increased Cold War rhetoric from the US under Reagan. And that established itself in a very weird sort of domestic political situation where there was the government, which was right-wing, and then there was an alternative majority in security questions, which was led by the Social Democrats and the left wing. And this alternative majority sort of imposed on the government that they should take these reservations, make these reservations in NATO. And this was very much contested. Denmarkization was a name invented at that point to sort of describe an ally that is freewheeling, that doesn't want to pay their dues, but expect all the protection from the alliance. And it has been an afterwards very contested period of time, especially because the foreign minister at this time, who was from the Liberal Party, he had to go to these NATO meetings and make these reservations, which he himself did not agree with. It was weird. It really was weird, but then again, it was not weird enough for the government to step down, and it was not weird enough for the alternative majority to just make a vote of misconfidence. So this actually, this took place for quite some years, from I think 82, 83 to 86 was the last footnote, and 88 was the end of the alternative majority. And thus ended the Cold War. And once again, we have this example of when the tensions around you, they decrease, you have an increased opportunity and increased influence capability. And that was not only for Denmark, that was actually for the whole of NATO. NATO was now one enemy down, and sort of needed to redefine itself to keep relevant, and NATO sort of redefined itself as someone who could operate more freely in the world, obviously, because the threat was gone. So they very much became an out of area alliance, and has been until now. This new sort of influence or opportunity space also caused quite huge alterations to Danish policy, which actually started under a social democratic government in the 90s already. It was like, okay, danger's gone, now we can pursue a more active foreign policy, and Denmark partook throughout the 90s in quite a lot of UN missions and NATO missions also in Kosovo. So there was definitely the sense of Denmark being free, and the Social Democratic Party sort of led this, government led this, Denmark being free of this constraint of the stress of the outside world. Nevertheless, in 2001, a new right-wing government took over, and they launched this battle of values, they called it, in which they sort of reaffirmed that Denmark should have a new activist foreign policy. Or they didn't reaffirm it as much as they sort of introduced it like it was something that they introduced. But they sort of stated that from now on, Denmark should be much more active and much more side by side with the US. And some of the reasoning behind this was that the Danish stance during the Cold War, and especially the 80s, with the footnotes, had been shameful, and there was a debt to pay, especially towards our main ally, the USA, and that was basically one of the arguments for going to war with Iraq. There was obviously that Saddam Hussein was bad and the weapons of mass destruction and all that, but actually a main argument in Denmark was that we need to be side by side with the US now because we failed them, and we need to be brave now because we were cowards during the footnote policy, and during the Cold War we were cowards during the occupation, German occupation, we didn't fight, so we need now to go out and stand up for what we believe and fight for that. And there's been Fabel, as I write, has written a PhD dissertation on this use of the history, mainly the history of social democratic security policy as a disciplining tool and a political tool for a very, very active military line on behalf of Denmark. Social Democrats initially voted against, they voted against attacking Iraq, but then once the attack had been made, they voted for staying there and participating in this security force. So they were, the rest of the left wing sort of remained their resistance towards the war in Iraq, but the Social Democrats turned and was backing up these few months later. This brings us to 22. As I have already stated, it's now a possibility, or the government is now working towards establishing a presence of US troops on Danish soil. And also, obviously, there is another marked development in the Nordic area, which is the application of the Swedish and Finnish NATO membership. And I argue that some of the things that makes this possible for Denmark now is probably some of the same forces that allows Sweden and Finland to also participate in NATO. I shall explain. So what has changed? Why is it? There's obviously been this historical development of the Social Democrats sort of dragging her feet into NATO, but then during the détente years, finding NATO a useful political tool. Then this very weird conflicting period in the 80s, and then from the end of the Cold War, sort of a commitment to a more active international foreign policy, and then in the 2000s, a really massive shaming of former policies, social democratic policies from the left wing. But then there's also the outside environment, obviously. And you could argue, or that is the obviously the argument for Sweden and Finland joining NATO now, is the renewed threat from Russia. Still, and this is what I repeat every time people ask, is there a new Cold War? I say no, because the Soviet Union was a global superpower. Russia is a regional great power, even though Putin doesn't agree, but I think he's the only one who sort of fails to acknowledge this. And Russia is not as strong or as threatening as during the Cold War. So standing up to them is, if that's what you want to call it, and that's what you want to do, you want to sort of signal to Russia that you want to stand up to them, that is less risky than it was during the Cold War. The Cold War was this threat of an all-out war, and it was very much about sort of keeping stable, keeping the balance, the terror balance, and some even talked about the Nordic balance, and not disrupting this very fragile but very stable system. This system has obviously broken down, and we're simply not as afraid of Russia as we were back then. And I argue that goes for Denmark, that goes for Sweden, that goes for Finland. So the irony, I write, it's the irony of a weak Russia is that Russia is so weak that it can no longer scare us into screening towards NATO. But it is still acting so erratically that especially, well, not only Sweden and Finland, but also Denmark is saying, well, we have to increase our deterrence. But this time we do it much more by NATO integration, this deterrence stance, and that is obviously, I argue, because we're not as afraid of a war as we used to be. And then you have a very strategically different Europe, and I shall show you a map well, it's sort of self-explanatory, this map, especially if you're Danish. You have in the Cold War map, you have Denmark as a frontline state and a direct neighbor via the Baltic to the Soviet Union, to Eastern Germany, to Poland, Warsaw Pact countries, which meant that if war were to break out, Denmark would be in the front line. Now, especially if Sweden and Finland joins, it's a whole other strategic picture, especially, I argue, with Poland and the Baltic countries joining NATO, because Denmark is now much more of a, we're not on the front line. Conversely, we are sending soldiers to the Baltic countries to sort of maintain deterrence over there. So it's also said a little simple. It's easier to be deterrent if you're sort of tucked away in maybe not relative safety, but more safety than you used to be. And this especially goes if Sweden and Finland joins, or when they join, the whole of the Baltic, almost the whole of the Baltic Sea will be a NATO sea. And then obviously Denmark's role is changing, and probably I would argue much more from a frontline country to a stepping stone country. That would mean a country from where troops are transported east, and from where it is going to be sort of strategically to make sense that we use Denmark as a stepping stone. And there's also talks in Denmark now about sort of rebuilding Esbjerg Harbor, which is turning, I don't know if you can see, but it's right there, and it's facing the UK, and sort of making that harbor bigger and more capable of receiving NATO reinforcements, because we are not going to stand in Denmark and fight. If that's what it comes to, we are going to ship those forces further east. So that is the external environment, and then I argue that there's also an internal factor, which is obviously the US emerged as the winner of the Cold War, or the sole superpower after the Cold War, and that position is somewhat on decline now, but the US became the dominant world power, and that's who you want to stay friends with, obviously. And there was a very much especially among the right wing, very much a wish to sort of to underline solidarity with the US, and really sort of say, yes, we're on your side and we will follow you through thick and thin. And a big report on the Danish wars in Afghanistan and Iraq actually concluded that the main reasoning was just to show solidarity with the US. That was the main reason for Denmark to go to war. And that obviously is connected to this thing that I call footnote shame, because my argument is that this right-wing sort of campaign of a battle for values and really shaming past security policies for being too appeasing somewhat succeeded. I mean, if you sort of look at on the Danish landscape of debate today, that is sort of the remaining rhetoric, and that is why I also argue that while up until the 80s the Danish security policy was formulated by the Social Democrats and then the right wing followed suit, I argue that it has somewhat been turned around, that the liberal governments of the zeros and the 2010s actually succeeded in formulating the Danish security policy and debate and rhetoric, and now it's the Social Democrats that follow suit. So they are no longer leading in this game, even though they are in government now. But they've also been somewhat forced to, should we say, they've been forced to also take a lead in NATO solidarity, because the opposite standpoint is so unpopular now and has been somehow connected with so much shame. And connected to that shame is obviously also the argument that Denmark has a debt to pay, and we didn't do enough. We didn't do enough during the German occupation. We didn't do enough during the Cold War. We even disrupted NATO solidarity in the 80s. So now it's time to pay back, and now it's time to stand with the United States. So that is my presentation. I think I went a little over time. I'm sorry for that, but I will stop talking now.
Thank you, Iben. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You don't have to apologize for anything. It was very interesting. I especially like your points about the irony of Russia actually being quite weak at the moment, and weaker than during the Cold War, and also your concept about footnote shame. But maybe we can return to these questions. But you talk about this footnote shame. But how would it have been different today if we have not seen this footnote policy in the 80s, you think?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question, and I don't really obviously it's hard to have an answer for that. But I think the closest comparison I have, obviously, or we have, is Norway. And well, Norway actually did put one footnote in there in 1986, but it didn't amount to a lot. And I think that if we look at Norway, which Denmark actually also tends to have followed in NATO, all our reservations were something that Norway also had. And Norway also, just a year before Denmark, said that they would now open up the territory for American troops. So that is the thing that is sort of due to external influence. But then looking at Norway's NATO policy, and there's been a really interesting cooperation made by Magnus Pettersson, the Swedish researcher, and someone else that I can't remember right now, which is embarrassing, but they actually did a comparison of Denmark and Norway during the Cold War and after, and the NATO policies. And what they find is that during the Cold War, Norway was more, well, not NATO happy. They were also somewhat reserved, but they were less reserved than Denmark. And after the Cold War, this picture has changed, that Denmark is contributing way more to NATO, as I said in the beginning, per capita than almost any other country. And Norway has not had the same sort of the same willingness to commit troops, mainly in quite the same extent. And I find that fascinating because what they conclude is that Denmark and Norway has actually shifted roles from the Cold War to after. And that is without being an expert of Norwegian politics, that's sort of when I look and I say, okay, so the external security environment is basically the same, but then internally, what's the difference? And there might be many more differences, but that is actually some of the things that that article, that research is very much what caused me to sort of think about that. And also in Norway, there hasn't been a debate about the Cold War like we have had in Denmark, which has been very, very rich with accusations of cowardice and shaming and footnote shaming, basically. So my point is that this value battle of the zeros, which also very much went for the Cold War, has influenced, because they haven't had that in Norway, not to the same extent.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Iben. Then I ask you to your other main point about the importance of Russia being weak at this moment for the reinforcement of pro-NATO policies, but isn't it, when we look at Finland and Sweden and the timing of their applying for NATO membership, isn't it also a question about the policies of Russia and aggressiveness at the moment?
Yes, and that's sort of why I call it the irony, because you should think that Russia, and I would say exceedingly as the war progresses in Ukraine, they don't look like a very strong country, but so yes, it is sort of a double, and I'm sort of grappling. I'm trying to write an article about this, and I'm trying to grapple with this, obviously, and they say that it is the renewed threat of Russia which has sort of scared Sweden and Finland into NATO. I would also argue maybe for Finland it's more about finding an occasion, because they were forced to be neutral during the Cold War, whereas for Sweden it's really that was the big shocker for me. Finland was sort of oh yeah, you expected that, but Sweden joining NATO is very wild. So obviously it is because of the renewed threat from Russia, but I think the threat response is dependent on. So there is a renewed threat. The question is, do you respond to that threat by ensuring or reassuring the one that's threatening you, reassuring them that you're neutral and you don't want to attack them and you don't want any trouble? Or do you respond to that threat by choosing deterrence, basically? So it's back to the sort of the pair of deterrence and reassurance and how you respond to a threat. And my argument is that precisely because Russia has sort of upped their threat threshold, but they're not strong enough to scare anyone into acquiescence. So the threat response becomes then more deterrence as opposed to reassurance, which was the threat response during the Cold War.
Okay, thank you, Eben. I think we are all much wiser on these questions now. It's some very interesting and relevant thoughts that you have presented for us today. And I don't think there's any more questions for now. So I will ask Jonas, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I would just like to say thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And for those of you who joined us late, this will also be on the Arab YouTube channel. And I will put out the link in the Nordic Labour History Network group, so you can listen to this if you missed the beginning. Thank you very much, Eben and
Thank
Jesper.
you.
And to the rest of you, we see you in November on the 15th. Thank you.